Hey everyone, today I want to talk about the diminishing importance of experience points in Dungeons & Dragons. I ran a poll recently and I asked whether or not you used milestones or experience points to advance your characters. And I was a little surprised when I saw that nearly 2/3 of the people that responded to the poll said that they use milestones to advance their characters as opposed to experience points. And this got me a little curious about how experience points have evolved over the time, going from back to original D&D through the different editions to today. And so I went back and was looking through those books and doing some comparisons of how XP was calculated in the different editions. And it was really interesting. And so I want to share some of what I found and talk a little bit about the pros and cons of those discoveries. So first of all, let's look at Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now, for first edition, there's several different variations of it. There's original D&D, there's advanced D&D, there's basic D&D, there's BECMI D&D. All of these generally are first edition. And just to keep things simple, I went back to the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, and I use that since that really kind of encompasses the general gist of what the rules are. So what I found in this one is that there are about 2 pages in the Dungeon Master's Guide that talk about how to calculate experience points. And the DM had a lot of discretion over how you distributed the experience points to the party. Each class leveled at different rates. So a cleric reached level 2 at 1,500 experience points. A fighter reached level 2 at 2,000 experience points, whereas a magic user didn't reach level 2 until they got 2,250 experience points. XP was also awarded for finding treasure. For every gold piece that you found, you received 1 XP of experience. There's an entire section spent explaining why this was an acceptable practice for first edition. Characters who had a score of 16 or higher in their prime requisite ability would get a 10% bonus on any experience points that they received. And the biggest thing that is different from today is that experience points were simply a prerequisite for leveling up, but it was not automatic. The DM ultimately decided whether or not a character had done enough to warrant leveling up, including looking at their roles in the different encounters and any time that they had their character spending doing study or practicing or apprenticeships, things like that. So the player needed to actively seek to level up their character by challenging that character during encounters. They couldn't just sit on the sidelines during the encounters. They had to actually do stuff, and the DM would watch that and award XP accordingly. In second edition, I found that there were 4 pages in the Dungeon Master's Guide that talked about how to calculate XP. A lot of similarities to first edition Advanced D&D. You again had the Dungeon Master had a lot of discretion as to how they determined the experience points for any particular player. XP being awarded for treasure was now an optional rule, and it actually even says be careful not to overuse it. So I thought that was interesting that there was a whole section in the first edition talking about why this was justified, and by the time you got to second edition, they were saying, okay, you may not want to use this, but it's here anyway. As with first edition Advanced D&D, there was a different rate of advancement depending on what class you were playing. XP was awarded for monsters that were faced and represented a threat to the party. There were story awards where characters could achieve milestones, but it was still in the form of XP. So the DM would award specific amounts of XP based on reaching that milestone. There was modifiers for the difficulty of the monsters that you faced based on the hit die of the monsters and any conditions that you had, such as being poisoned or things like that. There were a couple optional rules that were interesting. One of the optional rules allowed for individual XP to be granted based on actions that the character took during an encounter. So if a wizard mixed up a potion during the encounter, or a rogue used a special ability, or a fighter used something in their toolbox of things that they could do, you would actually get additional XP awarded to just those specific characters. There was no longer any automatic bonuses just for having high ability scores. You would actually have to do these special abilities in order to earn that extra XP. There was another optional rule that actually awarded individual XP based on the player being really creative. So if the player had a really good idea about how to solve a puzzle or what they should do in the dungeon, you could grant XP to that particular player. It's kind of like nowadays in 5th edition, you would grant inspiration to that player. Here, you would actually award XP to their character based on the player doing something. So those are both really interesting ways to me of trying to get the players more involved in the game by awarding specific XP to them for getting out of their box and doing things that are interesting. Once again, XP in 2nd edition was still just a prerequisite to leveling up. The DM ultimately had the final say as to whether a character would level up. And then 3rd edition was a major change in Dungeons & Dragons. So with the introduction of the D20 system, a lot of rules were streamlined, and XP went through some changes as well. Here, there's actually 5 pages dedicated to talking about how the Dungeon Master would calculate XP. Still a ton of DM discretion in determining that XP and how it's divided amongst everybody. There are no more rules at all for awarding XP for finding treasure. All the classes now advance at the same rate. So we no longer have different advancement tables for each of the different classes. There is just a single level advancement table that everybody uses. 3rd edition also introduced the challenge rating, or CR, for enemies rather than hit die and other modifiers. So the XP was granted based on the level of the characters versus the level of the monsters that they were facing. There were a few modifiers that you could use if there were specific players in that encounter who had a different level than the other characters. You could use those to get a different amount of XP, but it would all be added together and then still divided evenly amongst the entire party. There's an entire section that actually talks about awarding XP based on story elements, very similar to what you had in 2nd edition. So again, kind of a precursor to Milestones, but it's still in the form of you're awarding XP based on the story elements as opposed to just saying, hey, level up when you hit that milestone. Then we get to 4th edition. 4th edition had 3 pages talking about experience points, greatly simplified the way to calculate. Monsters have XP. You beat those monsters, you add up the XP, and you share it with the party. There are no challenge ratings in 4th edition. There's a table on one of those pages that talks about experience points that just shows here's the monsters and here's their XPs based on level and the number of players that you have. And it's just very, very quick to look up in this table and say, here's the XP that you are for those monsters. Add it up, divide it up, and there you go. There's also another table that talks about how to grant XP for quests, and it has a little reference about how to grant XP for skill challenges. All of the information you need about XP is contained just within a few pages, really simplified it, got rid of a lot of the other calculations that you would have to do. There's a brief mention about how the DM could alter the amount of XP in order to have the party advancing faster or slower than they would otherwise. But there's not really any guidance given on how they would do that. It more just is kind of a statement that just says, hey, just so you know, the Dungeon Master is ultimately the one that gets to decide how quickly everybody advances. It also has one reference to doing advancement based on number of encounters as opposed to specific XP. So still not true milestones, but it's simply saying, you know, once you do 8 encounters, you're going to level up to the next level. So you still have to do encounters, but it just saves you having to do all the calculations of XP based on monsters and stuff. So much more simplified now. But that is nothing compared to what happened in 5th edition. When 5th edition was released, they took experience points and completely made it almost not a thing. There is one page in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition that talks about experience points. A quarter of that is spent talking about absent players and how you deal with absent players when it comes to experience and leveling up. Then half the page is talking about milestone advancement and story-based advancement and session-based advancement. So not XP, but all about the ways you can advance players using these other methods, specifically milestones. There are actually only 2 paragraphs on this page that talk about experience points. The first one simply says to add up the XP of the monsters that they faced and divide it amongst the party. That's it. It's basically one sentence. And then for non-combat encounters, it says figure out how much XP they would have earned if it was combat and divide that amongst the party. Doesn't tell you how to do that. You have to figure it out on your own. But that's the extent of the information you get in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition on actually awarding experience points. So they really were expecting this to be milestone advancement when they got to 5th edition. So then I just kind of extended that a little more because I wanted to see how that played out in 5th edition. So I took a peek at Lost Mine of Phandelver, the first adventure for 5th edition, to see how did it handle XP. And you do notice that it does reference XP at the end of certain sections, and it says the characters will get 275 experience points when they complete this section, which should be enough to move them to level 2. It's awarding XP, but it's really only awarding it in a way to achieve the milestone of them getting to level 2. Carrying forward to Hoard of the Dragon Queen, which was the first hardcover adventure for 5th edition, this one looks much more traditional as far as XP. When you get to the end of a series of encounters, it actually tells you here's the XP they earn if they did this, and then here's the XP if they did this. If they went and completed this quest, they would get this XP. So it had a lot more references to XP, But I find it interesting because Hoard of the Dragon Queen was actually written by Kobold Press. It's not a Wizards product. It's by Kobold Press. So it makes me think that maybe they just weren't really fully aligned with this move towards milestones. So they were still writing their adventures using experience points as opposed to the milestones. And then after that, it's pretty much been milestones all the way. I looked at Princes of the Apocalypse and it doesn't really mention XP. At the end of certain chapters, it says the party should be at level 6 when they complete this chapter and things like that. When you look at Curse of Strahd and you look at Storm King's Thunder, you see flowcharts at the beginning of the books that tell you, here's all the different chapters in the book, and we're telling you exactly what level each of the characters should be at before they take on this chapter. So XP is rarely mentioned in those books. It's pretty much just saying you're going to do milestone advancement. And that's where we are today. So we've gone from this really heavy calculation-based approach to experience points that factored in classes and the ability score that you had and the monster's abilities and the things that you did during an encounter and the amount of treasure that you found, all these different variables that went into calculating experience points, to today where we basically, it's just in the hands of the DM to say, okay, now you guys level up. Is that good? Is it bad? I got a couple things, from a good perspective. Obviously, it's much simpler for the DM. They just get to say, okay, yeah, you guys level up. They don't have to do any of that math. There's no calculations involved at all. They simply keep track of what's going on and decide when it's time for the party to level up. So much simpler for the DM to manage that. And along those same lines, the DM now can completely control the advancement of the party. So you don't have to try to keep tabs on who has what amount of XP and whether they're going to level up now or they're not going to level up to the next session. But you need to keep everybody kind of about the same. You don't have any of that. The DM decides that, look, for the next session, the thing that we're going to do, you guys need to be at level 4. Go ahead and go up to level 4. And then you go to level 4. And when the DM decides that you need to be at level 5, the DM will send you to level 5. And that's the end of it. So much simpler way to manage everything and puts it into the hands of the DM to control the flow and the advancement of the players. On the downside, for me, I feel that you've lost an element of motivation for the players or the characters. If you're walking through a dungeon and you know that once you get to the end of that dungeon, you are going to level up, then your mission is really to just try to get through that dungeon as quickly as possible. And so there might be side quests and other doors or other rooms that aren't related to getting to the end of that dungeon that you ignore because it doesn't help you at all. You know that you have to get to the end of the dungeon. And so there's less incentive for the players, the characters, to take on those side quests, to kick down those side doors and see what's inside, because you don't have that notion of, oh, I need a little more XP. So let's go into this closet over here and see if there's any goblins or treasure or something that we can find that maybe will earn me a little bit of XP. Now, obviously with the DM still controlling the advancement, there's some element of that where they would still be in the mix. But it takes it out of the hands of the players at that point. Now the DM is deciding all that. Whereas if the player had the agency to say, you know what, I need XP, so we're going to go and do all these little side quests and so that I can earn my XP, that, puts it in the hands of the players and it makes the story more about them as opposed to strictly about the story. The other thing that I think it takes away from is that leveling up is no longer an objective anymore. It used to be that you would have a character and you're wanting to see this character through to 20th level or, in some version in 4th edition, 30th level. And so leveling up was something important to you, just like you want to try to get certain magic items or you want to try to find a certain amount of treasure. You're looking to accomplish certain things. Leveling up your character was something that used to be an important part of the game. But now it's not really a part of the game because you're just leveling up as part of the story. And so it doesn't really matter whether you level up because you're just going to level up when the story says it's time to level up and you'll get your things, but you don't actively work towards it because it's not an objective of yours. Your objective is to get through the story, and leveling up is just a side effect of going through the story. So that just changes the dynamic of how we play the game. And again, with all these, I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just interesting how it's changed. And we've reached a point where XP is just simply not a thing. Within Dungeons and Dragons, experience points is just not a thing anymore. And I find it interesting that it's changed and how it's evolved from this really complex thing to something that just simply doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, that's what I found out. Let me know your thoughts about experience points versus milestones in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Until next time, take care.